Hello, this is Michael Hexter, and welcome to Politics 2100 here on YouTube. So, in the last several videos, or not just the last, on and off in many of the videos in Politics 2100, I've been talking about the nature of the Democratic leadership and how to understand and to position oneself in relationship to both the Democratic Party and its leadership and also to the Republican Party. And to find a way where we can discuss truthfully the deficits and the strengths of those two political entities. I've talked often about the ability of people, like progressives such as myself, or let's say the desired ability for progressives like myself to be able to understand the difference between bad and worse. So the Republicans are worse than the Democrats. There are some Democrats that approach the worstness, okay, of the Republicans, and but we have a very particular problem in the United States of a politics that is dominated by money and by the mega donors, and that the two parties, while they differ slightly or markedly on some issues, there is a fundamental agreement in the leaderships of those two parties about who they serve, and they serve the corporate elite, the mega millionaires and billionaires. So, and they are, there are a few politicians that are struggling to differentiate themselves from, I think, somewhat authentically or somewhat honestly from that combination of corporate parties that are acting as a shield or as a veil over the dominance of the corporations and over our politics, and also over our economic life, and also billionaires. So individuals who are sometimes associated with a corporation and sometimes are simply people who have inherited money or have sold off their company, wherever they initially made their fortune, and then they simply have lots of money to influence, to buy off politicians, to build think tanks, to create a web of discourse, which politics is an outcome or is an outgrowth of our collective culture and discourse. So anyway, but there is a very important issue that comes up again and again, and that is what I'm calling here the sham morality of the Democratic leadership, that they are inauthentic and inconstant in their commitment to values that many people share, and in particular also the Democratic base is committing itself politically to a government that reflects those values to some degree. There are variations in that commitment and so forth and so on, but in any case, there is a way in which the core Democratic voters, or the people who are most reliable in voting for Democrats and going to primary elections and voting for candidates in primaries, that core of voters are people who feel most comfortable with the Democratic leadership, and that leadership is in my opinion, has very superficial or no commitment to the actual values they espouse. So it's a sham morality, and that is reflected off, like Joe Biden, for instance, and for that matter, Barack Obama, espoused principles or espoused commitment or made motions to be committed to certain values when they campaigned initially to become president, or when they campaigned for re-election. But they then in office quickly abandoned those principles, or what they're seeming principles, to then govern according to basically a corporate consensus, with some modifications. So it wasn't as though Barack Obama entirely allowed the corporate consensus of his time to dictate everything he did. His Affordable Care Act was a compromise with various corporate interests. So it wasn't anything that the health insurance industry was, went in its final form, that they were opposed to. It actually added to their business overall. So it wouldn't necessarily have been their idea. In other words, they wouldn't have necessarily initiated having the Affordable Care Act, but they recognized that they had in that deal a good deal for them once they cut out the public option and so forth and so on, and they sidelined any talk of Medicare for all. Or not they, but it wasn't also the impulse of Barack Obama to have that in his policy portfolio. So anyway, we have with Joe Biden someone who is maybe as or more committed, it depends on in which issue you're talking about, to this sort of corporate consensus, and who uses values, or the values that Democrats tend to favor, as a tool for him to get elected, and then to abandon those, or to simply and to be very indifferent in a way. And he's a very his morality to me seems very lax, and he seems tired. And I mean, he's an older man, but there are 80-year-old men and women who are still filled with the fire of their moral commitments, okay, on into their 90s, okay. But he is not that person. He is not warmed inside by a fire to commitment to values, and it's obvious in the way he governs, so forth and so on. On the other hand, he presents to what I consider, or people who I consider to be gullible, Democratic voters, who fall for the sham, who look at him as they're looking in a way as, I mean, there's one that's sort of a quote unquote practical way. In other words, if people think of themselves as being essentially consumers of politics, or consumers of the products that the political parties offer them, and they don't think of themselves as activists per se, they say, well, my consumption choices to say something about who I am. So if I consume the Democratic candidate or the Democratic Party, that means I am a certain kind of person, or to the Democrats at least, I'm a quote unquote better kind of person than the Republicans, because my candidate, in this case Biden, is something of a family man, seems to be devoted to his wife. He is largely, from all appearances, or most appearances. And there are some, things that make one question that, but relatively speaking, in terms of the politicians on offer in the current cycles, at least, or let's say in the 2020 election, but the choice between Trump and Biden was that I could claim myself, let's say me, Democratic voter, to be a better kind of or a family-oriented kind of person, or a person with values, or an internal moral compass even. So we had the choice there between someone who essentially showed almost no internal moral compass, and Donald Trump, and someone who seemed to sort of had glimmerings of a moral compass, and or at least who made stagey efforts to show himself to have a moral compass. To me, Joe Biden, 9 times out of 10 rubs me the wrong way. Sometimes he is able to do something clever, like he did in the State of the Union address, or sometimes with a reporter, he's able to be sort of marginally authentic, and authentic in part also means someone who will fight. So he sometimes shows the will to fight for something, but oftentimes he doesn't show the will or the interest to really fight and to take risks. I mean, he took one big risk in withdrawing from Afghanistan. So, it's not 100%, as with Obama, it's not across the board that he is a boring corporate, politician who's simply, a puppet, so to speak, of the mega donors. He does things that look like politics, that look like someone who understands that he's supposed to do statecraft, and he's supposed to do things that are, he spent his life in the federal government, his professional life, Joe Biden has. And so he, knows a lot about that from the point of view of someone who's 80s, 90s, 2000s politician. But anyway, that sham morality is something that we need to question, and we need to put a distance between us and that in order to really make any progress. And I'm saying this in part also, I'm trying to help Marianne Williamson, where I've been starting to, come to or learn more about Marianne Williamson. I am putting my feelers out for volunteering for her, and I'm watching some of her videos and so forth and so on. And she seems to be someone who is authentically interested in the moral dimension of politics, that she has moral commitments that make her, among other things, take the great risk and put a lot of energy into being a candidate for president in a long shot campaign. And so I admire her for that. And I think her recent moves, and I'll do another video about her economic Bill of Rights, her essentially efforts to revive the spirit of Roosevelt in the Democratic primary and potentially in the Democratic Party overall, and his efforts to create essentially a social democratic politics within the Democratic Party, and which it basically sort of became a weak version of that for 40 years or so, 35, 40 years. But anyway, that effort contrasts markedly, in my view, to that of Biden, and she I don't know her as well as she doesn't have the long record in politics that Biden has. So in some sense, I don't know how she would perform, let's say, if she were to become president or whatever. I don't know what her breaking points are, or her, all the different things. She seems to at least be able to use language in a way and to talk about these fundamental themes in a way that seems much more authentic than Biden does. And so I think there are alternatives to just living with this kind of inauthenticity, and that inauthenticity is not it's not something that's optional. It's not something that's impractical, or let's say authenticity is not impractical. It's exactly what would lead us to have political progress in a fundamental way, fundamental change in our society. We need politicians who are willing to stand up on the basis of their own values and their commitment to their people they're supposed to represent, and who are willing to stand up and brave criticism, brave the efforts of the corporate media, of corporate politicians, of large corporations to try to undermine them while they pursue the interests of the American people. And so, one of the things that people need to do that, to keep them on the track of that, is a sense of moral commitment inside them that drives them. So this is something that's considered by some people who are, Marxisant, or, supposed materialist, is supposed to be something that is unimportant, that's epiphenomenal, that's superstructural. But in my observation, that's one of the driving forces, not the only one, of actual change. Okay, not only in the heart of a leader of leadership, but also people willing to go out and break with their comforts. And one of the comforts of the Democratic Party base is to idolize, and people like Obama or Biden or Clinton or the Clintons, Hillary Clinton too, and to or Chuck Schumer, or other longtime Democratic politicians, and sort of think of them, Dianne Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi, and to think of themselves as being a better person or as a good person because their politician seems nicey nice or whatever it is, or they don't sound like the sort of increasingly deranged right wing in the United States, that they're sort of, I'm with the non-deranged people. We need to do somewhat better than just non-deranged. And some of that non-derangement is, okay, they're just self-interested. So, and I mean, actually, if members of the Democratic Party leadership were more, as politicians, self-interested, not so much in terms of as political, as corrupt politicians, but as simply as people who want to get elected and reelected, that would actually be a step forward. But that desire for the acclaim of the voters, ongoing, continuing acclaim of voters, and being driven by that, I think requires some more of this, what I'm calling authentic moral commitment, and not just sham morality. So anyway, I'm sorry that this video didn't focus on one particular issue, but this is something that continually comes up over and over again. And in the context of looking at how the Democratic Party leadership operates and how they use this sham morality of theirs to gull people, essentially, and particularly in primaries. So the primary is where this kind of discussion makes most sense, because in general elections, you are faced now with the hyper-destructive fanaticism, the theocratic or fascistic fanaticism of the Republican Party, and so you need the sort of this kind of sort of corporate sham person to get them into an office is less harmful than getting the Republican in that office, or than in somehow not being able to prevent the Republican from getting into that office. So I think we need to be talking more about this, because it's for someone, I mean, I don't know if I'm not the most, authentic, most more, there are people who I think are quote unquote better people than I am, or whatever it is, but it's like, I believe in authentic moral commitments, and I believe that people are capable of it, and people can get together and have a community of people who are more committed to realizing ethical ideals and trying to make that happen in a realistic way, in a way that isn't a hyper moralistic moral panic, or a cultural revolutionary style, sort of totalitarian kind of sort of more puritanical moral straitjacket of some kind, but that simply that we try to enact through our politics, the economy, that we create a from the structure of our society, not necessarily monitoring every individual act per se, but creating a structure of society that allows people to be their better selves. Okay, and that requires government action. That requires, I think, authentic moral commitments. In any case, if you have any thoughts about these issues, please share them in the comments. If you find this interesting or thought-provoking, please like the video, and also please subscribe to Politics 2100. Thanks.